Government spending is usually described in simple ways. Either it helps people or it wastes money. Either it stimulates the economy or it creates debt. But the real cost of government spending is often harder to see, because the visible spending is only the first layer. The deeper cost shows up later in inflation, in interest payments, in distorted incentives, in rising asset prices, and in the growing dependence of the system on permanent expansion. That is why government spending is not just about what gets funded. It is also about what gets quietly repriced around it. Most people imagine government spending as if it were similar to household spending. Money comes in, money goes out. If too much goes out, there is a problem. That sounds intuitive, but governments do not operate like households. They can borrow at scale, they can issue debt, they can roll obligations forward, and they can influence demand far beyond what any private actor can do. That makes government spending far more powerful than ordinary spending, but it also makes the hidden costs harder to trace, because the consequences are often delayed, distributed, and indirect. When governments spend, they do not only transfer money from one place to another, they change the structure of demand. Some sectors receive more support, some industries grow faster, some projects become viable, some prices get lifted by new flows of money. This matters because modern economies are not neutral machines. They react to incentives, so spending is not just an amount, it is a directional force. It tells the system where expansion should happen. That can be useful, but it can also create imbalances, especially when spending grows faster than the real economy can absorb productively. One hidden cost of heavy government spending is inflation pressure. Not always immediately, not in the same way every time, but when public spending adds demand into an economy already facing supply limits, prices tend to respond. More money competes for labor, materials, housing, services, and energy. If production cannot expand smoothly enough, prices rise. This is why government spending can feel beneficial at first while becoming expensive later. The spending is visible, the price adjustment is slower, but the adjustment still arrives. And once it spreads, the cost is carried by everyone using the same economy. Government spending does not always show up first in consumer prices. Sometimes it flows into assets, financial markets, housing, public contracts, corporate valuations, land values. Why? Because large fiscal flows do not move through society evenly. They interact with credit, expectations, and investor behavior. If markets believe spending will support growth, or liquidity, or future nominal expansion, asset prices can rise before wages do. That creates a hidden divide, because the people closest to assets absorb the upside first, while everyone else sees the secondary effects later: higher housing costs, higher valuations, and harder entry into ownership. So spending can widen inequality even when it is politically framed as broad support. Government borrowing feels manageable when interest rates are low. That is why debt can accumulate quietly for years. But debt is never only about the principal. It is also about servicing the cost of carrying it. When rates rise, old borrowing becomes more expensive to refinance. New borrowing becomes heavier. Budget flexibility shrinks. This is where one of the biggest hidden costs appears. Future spending gets crowded by past commitments. More tax revenue is absorbed by debt service. Less is available for current priorities. And governments become more dependent on keeping growth alive just to stabilize what they already owe. That is not a headline cost, but it is one of the most important ones. Another hidden cost is dependence. Once a sector, region, or system adapts to sustain public spending, removing that support becomes politically and economically difficult. Projects are built around it, jobs depend on it, prices adjust to it, institutions normalize around it. That means spending is not always temporary, even when it is introduced as temporary. The economy begins pricing it in, and once that happens, withdrawing support can feel like causing a crisis. So spending creates a ratchet effect. It is easier to add than to remove. That makes long-term fiscal discipline harder, not because no one understands the risk, but because the system becomes structurally used to the support. Government spending also changes politics. Because once budgets expand, expectations expand with them. Citizens expect continuity. Industries expect support. Markets expect backstops. Local systems expect renewal. This narrows future political choices, not because leaders want less freedom, but because prior commitments make flexibility harder. The public sees a spending promise. The hidden system sees a future obligation. That matters, because each round of spending can make the next round more necessary, especially when the economy slows, debt rises, or interest costs climb. So the political cost is not only how much was spent, it is what future choices became harder after this was normalized. This does not mean all government spending is bad. That would be too simplistic. Some public spending is essential. Infrastructure, health systems, education, basic services, crisis support, long-term capacity building. These can strengthen the economy. The real issue is not whether governments spend. It is whether spending increases productive capacity or only supports demand in the short term. If spending makes the system stronger, more efficient, or more resilient, it can justify its cost. If it mainly postpones adjustment, inflates prices, or builds future obligations without equivalent capacity, the hidden costs grow much larger. That is the distinction that matters. The cost of government spending depends heavily on timing. Spending into a weak economy can stabilize demand. Spending into a constrained economy can intensify inflation. Spending during low-rate environments feels cheap. Spending during higher-rate environments becomes much heavier over time. This is why the same policy can feel helpful in one period and destabilizing in another. The hidden cost is not only in the amount, it is in the context. What capacity exists? What supply limits exist? What debt burden already exists? What interest rate environment exists? Without context, the spending debate becomes moral theater. With context, it becomes structural analysis. The hidden cost of government spending becomes largest when the economy is already dependent on continuous expansion. Because then spending is not just a policy tool, it becomes part of the system's survival logic. Governments spend to support growth. Growth supports tax revenue. Tax revenue supports debt service. Debt service protects financial stability. Financial stability protects asset values. Asset values protect confidence. That loop becomes self-reinforcing. And once the system is inside that loop, cutting spending becomes more difficult, even when the long-term costs are obvious. That is why government spending debates often feel trapped. The issue is no longer one program. It is the architecture underneath all of them. Most people never experience government spending as a line item. They experience it through consequences. Higher rent, higher prices, higher taxes later, lower budget flexibility, more expensive borrowing, services that still feel underfunded even after massive spending totals. That disconnect creates frustration, because the public sees large numbers being spent, but daily life does not always feel easier. That is the hidden cost showing up, not as one dramatic collapse, but as a slower repricing of ordinary life. The hidden cost of government spending is not simply debt, it is distortion. Distortion in prices, distortion in incentives, distortion in political expectations, distortion in future flexibility. Some of those distortions may be worth accepting if the spending builds real capacity. But many are not visible when the money is first announced. That is why fiscal policy is so often misunderstood. People focus on the visible benefit today. The harder question is what the system quietly becomes tomorrow. Government spending is never just about what gets funded. It is about what the spending changes around it. Prices, incentives, debt burdens, asset values, political expectations, future room to move. That is the hidden cost. Not because spending never helps, but because every large intervention leaves a structural footprint. And in a system already built on debt, credit, and permanent expansion, those footprints do not disappear. They accumulate.